In the schedule, we have a brief welcome by the Michigan Tech Dean of College of Arts and Sciences, and one of the most knowledgeable individuals when it comes to history of railroads and rail policy. So, welcome, Bruce Seeley.
I want to thank everyone who is here from out of town as part of the career fair and the railway night. We've gone out of our way weather-wise to make it easy for all of you to get in and out this year.
Thank you.
By foregoing snow. But in the meantime, there's some other things. I am a historian of technology and transportation by training. And so Posse asked me to make a few opening remarks, and I can't help but say a few things that come from that perspective as a transportation historian. It's fascinating to me, and for those around the railroad industry, that this is an industry in which it has one of the largest fixed capital investments, which you would think would make it a fairly inflexible kind of organization. After all, the commitment of the investment that you make ties you literally to the ground about where and how you can go. And yet, this is an industry that over its entire history has had to cope with change. And so I thought I might make that point by looking back at where railroading was 80 years ago. 80 years ago, we were just at the bottom of the Great Depression. It was just before Franklin Roosevelt took office as President of the United States, after two of the most horrific years the country had encountered in terms of the economy. And this would have been the state of the art in terms of motive power, and given the attention to that kind of issue, I think in this evening's talk I sort of looked at it that way. But a very large, very powerful, very efficient steam locomotive, and yet the changes that the industry would face, that it seemed not even to contemplate very much, were really pretty apparent. The hints of change were evident in the fact that by the 1920s, the first new kinds of locomotives called oil electrics, 600 horsepower switchers, had just begun to appear on American railroads. 2 years from now, from 1932, would be the groundbreaking appearance of the first lightweight diesel-powered, the Burlington Zephyr, which made a record-breaking run from Denver to Chicago in May of 1934 and inaugurated an entirely new approach to thinking about the passenger movement on American railroads. The response of the industry initially was to try to find ways to take those steam locomotives and turn them into something modern looking by streamlining, which when done later, it was often discovered that the shrouds actually hurt and did not help aerodynamic resistance, but they looked modern, which is what the intention was. So by 1934, the New York Central, by 1936, the Pennsylvania had hired an industrial designer named Raymond Loewy, who produced some of the most really intriguing artifacts of industrial design that you've ever seen. And then the Milwaukee Road, with its streamlined Hiawatha, set a path where those trains ran from Chicago to Milwaukee, 100 miles in 60 minutes, setting a path. But that still wasn't where the industry was really going to go, because this was just the hint, the beginning of dieselization. Introducing diesels is today in some business schools, certainly in some areas of history, a classic case in trying to understand how difficult the process of innovation can be. Because the company that really pushed forwards on diesels would be something called the Electromotive Corporation, EMC, which by the end of the 1930s became a division of General Motors. And EMD would basically come to dominate the development of diesel locomotives. Early hints of this were very much related to that streamlining picture like the Super Chief. But in 1939, General Motors introduced what they called the FT, which was a 4-unit diesel locomotive that put out to travel almost 90,000 miles on American railroads, demonstrating to very, very skeptical rail engineers that this 4-unit arrangement could in fact be more efficient than the steam locomotives that all of these guys had grown up with. And many of them were skeptical, but this in 1 year convinced American railroads this was the future. And the only thing that delayed its introduction was World War II, which prevented the full adoption. But by the time the war ended, it was pretty clear where the railroads were going to go. But what was really fascinating was who would come to dominate the process of building motive power for American railroads. We had companies like Baldwin, which we'll say something about in a minute, or Alco, the American Locomotive Company, and of course EMD. And very quickly, the road switcher, as it was called, came to be the standard. Rather than worrying about car body design and aerodynamic streamlining, this is function that would come to drive these designs. But what really shocked the industry was that Baldwin Locomotive, which was the largest locomotive manufacturer in the world, it set the standard, would basically fall off the face of the earth in 10 years after World War II. Baldwin had built over 70,000 locomotives in its time. And yet in the last 10 years or so of its existence, it sold about 75 diesel locomotives. American Locomotive, a very close competitor, Alco, managed to sell a couple of thousand, but it's EMD, with just those road switchers that we saw, that comes to dominate the industry, because what they were doing was applying the kinds of mass production assembly techniques of a standardized design that General Motors had set up and Ford, of course, had pioneered. And this was what gave EMD, because you could count on these things being enormously reliable, extremely efficient, and above all, almost perfectly designed for the job that they were confronting. Baldwin goes out of business, Fairbanks Morse goes out of business, Alco goes out of business, EMD. And yet, change is not something that stops just with a firm being dominant in the industry. EMD has had a really intriguing history over the last 50 years since it became the locomotive builder. About 1959, 50 years ago, it began trying to expand overseas sales. It had done that already in Central America. It sent locomotives to Europe after World War II, but it opened up especially avenues in India, and it continued trying to build those connections. It celebrated those quite recently. But in 2005, GM spun off EMD into its own entity, part of the problems of the American auto industry. In 2008, EMD produced, and you can see in the middle image, the first jointly produced diesel between it and the Chinese railroad industry. And most interestingly, there's a story I ran across on the EMD site about work it's doing with Norfolk Southern to expand biodiesel from the 5% or so of the mix that it can use to 10, 15, and 20%, an ongoing project. Who would have thought that a railroad company would be playing this kind of lead and trying to worry about this in places as far-flung as India and China? The picture is one of change and trying to cope with change. Which brings us back to where the story started, with the hint of diesel in passenger service, something that none of the railroad companies represented in the room tonight are really very much centered on. We have some passenger rail in this country, of course, through Amtrak. We have some interesting designs, but then nothing that comes close to matching this Chinese high-speed rail, which is one of 40 locomotive sets that it built to cruise at 236 miles an hour. The question of change still confronts us. It's a highly politicized issue, of course, with high-speed rail. But it is fascinating to me that 80 years ago, when American railroads were wondering how their world was going to shake out and how they could hold on to business that otherwise seemed to be disappearing in passenger, how would it cope with change? Who would have thought that the industry would look like it does now? At that time, there were more than 100 Class 1 railroads in this country. Today, by my count, I think there are, someone will correct me correctly, 7? 7 plus Amtrak. It's an intriguing issue of trying to stay on top in a world where change is the only constant that we can count on. And so maybe with that in mind, for all you young people looking at a world that's changing around you probably faster than you can grasp, it also affects every industry in it. So anyway, with those remarks in mind, I'd like to welcome you all to the Railroad Night. We're glad to have you here, and maybe we have a chance to start doing something like